almost gave my talk.
Basta.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here and to come back to Canio. Is a place that I feel very much at home. It must be like you, Canio, who come. You have to come here every Monday, otherwise maybe life isn't fulfilled. But if I don't speak, I mean, which is why I always volunteer to speak at the to do the Italian at the Melville Moby Dick, because at least for sure I'll be able to speak in connection with Canio's. Marianne wonderfully gave the title of the talk, Grapes and Concrete, and I am not going to be talking about Grapes of Wrath, because if you know Grapes of Wrath, there are no Italians in that novel. I came to John Steinbeck the way many other people come to him. You read him in school, you go to college, likely to read him again. Typically it's Grapes of Wrath, maybe you might get Tortilla Flats and something else. And there was a time when I was interrogating all the American writers that I had come in contact with to see what did they have to say about Italians. The same way that I was kind of talking and asking myself, you know, when I went to the University of Chicago, I felt, oh my God, I don't belong here. I'm Italian. They wouldn't even let my grandfather do the lawn here, probably. But here I am. Am I welcome here? And it was because for me, academia, coming from a working class community, academia was not a very comfortable place. The Irish nuns, when I was a kid, didn't make it comfortable for us. They quite often, if we, you know, sometimes we would talk behind the nuns' back in dialect. We thought it was Italian, and if they heard us, they would wash our mouths out with soap. So we learned very quickly that, you know, Italian was not wanted there, and the same thing for the high school that I went to. But things have changed, fortunately, over the years. So I started looking back at what did these writers have to say about the Italians, whether it was Henry James or Mark Twain, and I've written on all of these. And it comes to Steinbeck, Marianne says, we're doing this thing on Steinbeck. I said, did you know that Christ in Concrete came out in 1939, and the same year that Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and everybody knows Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, but nobody knows Christ in Concrete. Why is that? And that has been the basis for my career in Italian American Studies, which I'm kind of in the twilight of right now, although I keep trying to put more light in there to make it look like afternoon. So years ago, I was driving down the road on my way from San Jose to Fresno, California, and I was struck by the number of Italian names that appeared on highway billboards. Wineries, food businesses, tile companies, and then I noticed a sign for a Salinas exit. I had obviously been going in the wrong direction. But I was happy for the mistake, as I had been able for the first time to get a look at the geography covered in much of what Steinbeck has written. And I wondered if there had been as many Italians back in his time as there were today. Now, Steinbeck was always writing about this area, the same area where the Italians were as well Japanese, who were considered enemy aliens for a period, who had been arrested and relocated during World War II in February of 1942, where radicchio seeds from Italy thrive. This is that Salinas. Radicchio seeds from Italy thrive, where Japanese planted the garlic that made Gilroy famous. The scene, I realize, is all about these days, but back in those days, migrants like the Chicanos, whom Steinbeck calls paisanos, and the white migrant workers called Okies, were the dominant subjects of his writings. And his concern was the interaction between the natives and those other migrants who had come to California from places out east and south. So the Italians had not played a major role in his earlier works. As far as I can tell, to this day, no one still has yet written a word about the Italians in Steinbeck's works. Having scoured all his major novels and stories, I found very little presence of them, but what I've noticed about those that I've found is that his earliest depictions are more like caricatures. He kind of throws them in just to move the story along. And it's not until his later work that Italian figures become full-blown characters. His later work happens when he's living here in Sag Harbor. For the purposes of my talk today, I want to concentrate on two Italians who play significant roles in two of Steinbeck's novels. Torelli, who comes from his 1935, his pre-Grapes of Wrath, Tortilla Flat, and Alfio Marullo, who comes in Winter of Our Discontent, which takes place right where we're staying. A little over 25 years apart. Tortilla Flat was 1935, and Winter of Our Discontent was 1961. And completely different characterizations. But before I go into the readings, I need to lay a little groundwork for understanding the difference between caricatures and characters. Now, the earliest presence of Italians in Steinbeck's work is minimal, since his attention was drawn to the tension between the landowners and the workers of the land, kind of a working class bourgeois conflict. So it is not surprising then that Italians who do appear, such as Torelli in Tortilla Flat, are simply drawn caricatures and not developed into full-blown characters. Oxford English Dictionary tells us that in art, a caricature is, quote, a grotesque or ludicrous representation of persons or things by exaggeration of their most characteristic and striking features, and a portrait of other artistic representation in which the characteristic features of the original are exaggerated with ludicrous effect. This often happens. It has to happen in theater, film, and so on, where we need to get instant recognition so we have an understanding that drives the plot towards a climax. Often caricatures are more easily recognized than a detailed portrait that is faithful to a person's visage. We see that in creating Torelli, Steinbeck uses those broad brushstrokes of high-strung temperament, exaggerated behavior, and one-dimensional thinking to reflect Italian culture in this novel. Now, unfortunately, this is the same kind of stereotypes that have been worked on for at least a century in the United States. And as I was telling Canio before we began, I'm working on a book on humor and irony in Italian-American culture. And so there's this whole tradition of the use of Italian as an exotic other in American literature. That's a whole nother talk. In Tortilla Flat, Steinbeck acknowledges the presence of Italians in his early descriptions of Monterey. He makes a distinction between them and the Chicanos, who are the major subject of that novel. He writes, the lower parts of the town are inhabited by Americans, Italians, catchers and canners of fish. But on the hill where the forest and town intermingle, where the streets are innocent of asphalt, innocent of asphalt, and the corners free of streetlights, the old inhabitants of Monterey are embattled as the ancient Britons are embattled in Wales. These are the paisanos, these are the Chicanos. And he almost elevates them to this kind of noble. We learn early on that there is a great deal of tension between the Italians and the Chicanos. And while it is a tension that motivates much of the behavior between members of each group, one might speculate that this tension could be since Italians here are the new immigrants and they're doing financially better than the Chicanos who had inhabited these lands long before the Italians' arrivals. But Steinbeck never explains this, as the following makes clear. And he writes, race antipathy overcame Danny's good sense. He menaced the fishermen, Sicilian bastards he called them, and scum from the prison island, and dogs of dogs of dogs. He cried, Chinga de ladre, Dio. He thumbed his nose and made obscene gestures below the waist. The fishermen only grinned and shifted their oars and said, hello, Danny. Where do you get home? How come around tonight? No, when do you get home? Come around tonight. We got new wine. The Italians were fishermen like the father of Joe DiMaggio and providers of wine. Steinbeck draws one of them by the name of Torelli in his novel, who along with his wife becomes a foil for the follies and tricks of the paisanos and Danny. Torelli's Italianness comes to us in wildly emotional reactions to the paisanos and never is grounded in anything resembling real Italian-American culture. Another dimension of his caricature results from the fact that he is never given a first name. He's just Torelli, like Dante or something. Michelangelo, he's just given a first name. He runs a store with his wife where Danny and his paisanos get their wine, and in the process they take advantage of both. but especially the wife. The paisanos, quote, cousined their supper out of Mrs. Torelli. They slapped her on the buttocks and called her a butter duck, and took little courteous liberties with her person, and finally left her flattered and slightly tousled. Torelli is all business, not friendly toward men who had neither money nor barterable property. He never becomes more than a reactive figure to the antics of the paisanos. We get very little information about him, which keeps us from sympathizing much at all with him. Torelli was a forceful man to whom explanations, no matter how carefully considered or beautifully phrased, were as chaff. Moreover, Torelli had, Pilon knew, the Italians' exaggerated and wholly quixotic ideal of marital relations. They get food and sex from his wife, and on the way out, take along some firewood. Pilon says, it is seldom one finds all things at one market: wine, food, love, and firewood. We must remember Torelli, Pablo, my friend. There is a man to know. We must take him a little present sometime. Here again, Torelli becomes a target for the exhibition of the paisano's wit. Once the character Pilon returns with his friend Big Joe's pants and tries to trade them for wine. Mrs. Torelli refuses at first, but then gives in and hands him a quart of wine. For the Chicanos, the Italians serve as a surface against which he could deflect his self-anger. He refers to her as, quote, a Jewess who cheats me out of Big Joe pants. He goes on to rationalize his antipathy toward the Italian woman. Pilon thought sadly of his friend out there on the beach. What could he do? If he came into town, he would be arrested. And what would this harpy have done to deserve the pants? She had tried to buy Pilon's friend's pants for a miserable quart of miserable wine. Pilon felt himself dissolving into anger at her. When he leaves, he grabs the pants, and for good measure grabs a blanket Danny had earlier traded for wine. Torelli's strongest present comes in later chapter entitled How Danny Brooded and Became Mad, How the Devil in the Shape of Torelli Assaulted Danny's House. In this chapter, a restless Danny takes off with his friends and believes that eventually he will come to Torelli's house for wine. They gather outside the store, but Torelli doesn't let him in. There, Torelli tells him the story of the last time he saw Danny. Danny bought 3 blankets and 2 cooking pots. I gave him a gallon of wine. What did that devil do then? My wife he insulted. My baby he spanked. My dog he kicked. He stole my hammock from my porch. Torelli gasped with emotion. I chased him to get my hammock back, and when I returned, he was with my wife. Seducer, thief, drunkard. Torelli promises he will see that Danny goes to prison. The response of Danny's friend, Pilon, is, O Jew, if thou wert a little more charitable in thy wine, these things would not happen. See that thou keepest that cold frog, which is thy tongue from the dirtying of our friend. See thou treatest him gently, for his friends are many. We will tear thy stomach out if thou art not nice to him. I want you to remember that passage, even though it's kind of hard to articulate, because there's similar passages in the next novel we're going to look at, Christ in Concrete. The next day, Torelli is seen heading to Danny's house. Seldom did the face of Torelli, writes Steinbeck, show any emotions but suspicion and anger. In his capacity as a bootlegger and in his dealings with the people of Tortilla Flat, those 2 emotions were often called into his heart, and their line was written on his face. Moreover, Torelli had never visited anyone. As he nears the house, the children cower. Dogs slink away, and people step out of his path and clench their fists to repel a madman. Torelli has in his pocket a bill of sale that proves he bought Danny's house for $25 the night before. As he walks, he speaks aloud. Nests of snakes, he said. I will wipe out this pestilence of Danny's friends. Nor more will I give wine for goods and have the goods stolen again. Each man alone is not so bad, but the nest of them, Madonna, look down how I will cast them out into the street. The toads, the lice, the stinging flies, when they sleep in the woods again, they will not be so proud. When Torelli arrives at the front of the house, he waves the bill of sale in the air, and when he tells Danny's friends, Pilon calls it a dirty wop lie, and snatches the paper out of Torelli's hand and pops it into a stove. Once again, the paisanos have tricked him out of his property. That's nearly the last we see of Torelli until the preparation for the end of Danny's big party, when everyone wants to buy wine from him, and his spirits have changed so that he suggests to his wife that they go to the house and, quote, "I will take a few gallons for my friends." As a caricature of Italian, Torelli serves a purpose only to advance the plot. But as we'll see, Torelli becomes the basis for the creation of Steinbeck's most fully developed Italian in his novel, Our Winter of Discontent. Now, during the time between the two novels, Steinbeck had traveled to Italy in 1943. He spent time in Sicily and Naples writing about World War II. In 1955, he moved to Long Island, which at the time was becoming the promised land for Italian Americans who had only a generation earlier arrived in the U.S. and settled in the inner city, Little Italy. So a lot of people complained that the Italians kind of abandoned their Little Italies and things, saying, well, they didn't want to be there to begin with. They didn't name them Little Italies. Other people had done that. Their idea was always to have some land. And Long Island gave that to them. They were now moving out to places like Massapequa and Sag Harbor, intruding on wasps of old seafarer families like the ancestors of the novel's protagonist, Ethan Allen Hawley. The immigrant in this novel is Alfio Marullo, who has been in the United States for 47 years. Steinbeck does not linguistically characterize his immigrant status by giving him a consistent accent. However, he does show Marullo's immigrant identity by using non-standard word order. I'm going to talk about where he gets the thouist and the theist and that of the earlier novel, and the idea of word order to show ethnic identity. He is a loner. Marullo is very much an atypical Italian, at least from the ones we know from historical accounts and sociological studies. He is a loner and seems to have absolutely no connections to his home, no connections in the community. We never get to find out why he might have left Sicily, and are told only that he had entered the country illegally. He has no sense of community. Throughout most of the novel, he is presented as the antithesis of the protagonist, Hawley. But as we learn in the end, unlike Torelli, he is a man of honor and ultimately does the right thing. As is typical of Italian masculinity, Marullo, guided by a code of male behavior known in Sicily as omertà. A lot of people think omertà came to us through the gangsters. We don't talk about it, but it comes from the Spanish word hombredad, which was the way that noble men were expected to carry themselves, and the Italians underneath that began adopting this idea. Since the fall of, and I'm going to explain this idea a little bit here. Since the fall of the Roman Empire, Italian manhood has been an ever-changing distillation of all of the cultures that have invaded and occupied the Italian peninsula. Anybody who says they're 100% Italian doesn't know what they're talking about. Codes of behavior put forth by Baldassare Castiglione, the Book of the Courtier, and Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, originally designed for nobility, eventually touched all levels of Italian society. A man was expected to be able to handle his own problems with coolness and detachment. There has always been an importance in controlling one's public behavior, evidenced by the phrase fare una bella figura, or to cut a good figure. Self-control had to be achieved in such a way as not to reveal the effort one took. The achievement is called sprezzatura, or the art of making things look effortless. The Italian word omertà, said to be a version of the Spanish hombredad, has come to mean silence, but refers to proper male behavior. Italian masculinity is typically expected to be displayed through actions rather than words. In fact, if you go to the State House in Maryland, you'll see on the floor, le parole sono femmine, goes an Italian saying, words are feminine, I fatto sono maschi, actions are masculine. It's written right on the floor of the State House in Maryland. Thus, masculinity in Italy was something that one had to display and prove in public. Marullo can only live with sins until others know. It is when his crimes become public that he admits his wrongdoings and boldly faces the consequences. He lives by this notion of bella figura, even though his physical description belies this. And here's how Steinbeck describes it. Wide as a bear and sack-chested so that his arms seemed short and stood out from his body. His hat was on the back of his head so that his stiff iron-gray bangs showed like a cap. Marullo's eyes were wet and sly and sleepy, but the gold caps of his front teeth shone in the light from the cold counter. Two top buttons of his pants were open, showing his heavy gray underwear. He hooked little fat thumbs in the roll of his pants under his stomach and blinked in the half-darkness. To gain a sense of Marullo's makeup, it's important to know that the Italian-American man is the result of the interaction of centuries of Italian masculinities encountering of this variety of masculinities that have come up to make the American man. Mass immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century threatened this long-standing tradition of social order and would bring Italian notions of masculinity into contact with those of the United States. Americans were fearful of the early Italian immigrants who were characterized in newspapers and literature as dark, dirty, and dangerous strangers. Or the other half is when someone like Valentino comes along. He threatens the typical American masculinity because of being much more effeminate than is common. Newspapers were filled with accounts of urban crime attributed to the Italian immigrant. Henry James, an Italophile, Henry James loved Italy, disassociated himself from the Italian immigrants, characterizing them once as, quote, gross aliens to a man. Most of these men proved to be hard workers, much in demand by employers. Most of the Italian immigrants were men who came to make money and return to Italy. A great number of these men took up living with fellow Italian workers or boarded with Italian families. It was felt that without the refining influences of women and lacking the traditional social controls that modified male behavior, the men would not only become corrupted, but also turn their corrupting behavior toward American women. Such thinking led to the characterization of the Italian immigrant man as a brute, and it wouldn't be until Italians learned English that alternative representations would appear. Now, at first, this is the function of Marullo's character. He comes to represent a threat to the old Anglo-cultural expectations. But as we will see, a fuller development of that beyond Torelli enables Marullo to move from caricature to character and provide a relief against which we come to judge the protagonist, Ethan Allen Hawley's character and behavior. In this novel, Hawley comes off as, quote, a pure product of America with, quote, pilgrim fathers and whaling captains right in one family. He works for Marullo, first described as, quote, a Catholic and a wop, who has taken over the family's grocery business after the Hawleys had fallen on hard times and were forced to sell it. Hawley finds himself in the embarrassing situation of having to work for someone else in the business that was once his family's. Marullo at first seems very much like Torelli in that he seems to have a one-track mind focused on business, accumulating profit for his own personal benefit. He is referred to by Baker, the banker, as, quote, the one-man mafia. When Baker talks to Hawley of, quote, opportunities our ancestors never dreamed of that are, quote, being picked up by foreigners, he implies that Marullo is one of the less deserving foreigners, which exacerbates Hawley's sense of failure. When Steinbeck first brings Marullo and Hawley together, Marullo strongly criticizes Hawley's lack of business sense. You got to learn the tricks, kid, or you go broke. He tells him to get rid of the people who don't pay their bills, whereas Hawley sees these people as good for it. Hawley calls him a chiseler, and Marullo says it's good business. But Hawley can't take much more of this failure being rubbed in his face, and angrily retorts, "You listen to me. Hawley's been living here since the middle 1700s. You're a foreigner. You wouldn't know about that. We've been getting along with our neighbors and being decent all the time. If you think you can barge in here from Sicily and change that, you're wrong." And he threatens to hit his boss if he calls him kid again. One great irony of the novel is that this foreigner has more honor inside of himself than any of these, quote, native Americans, and proves to be more of a man when he must confront his problems. We get a glimpse into the possibility of Marullo being honorable when he defends himself against Hawley's threat. "I don't talk very good English. You think Marullo is Guinea name, Wap name, Dago name. My genitori, my name is maybe 2,000-3,000 years old. Marullos is from Rome. Valerius Maximus tells about it. What's 200 years? You don't come from here. 200 years ago, you don't either." Ethan's anger begins to abate, and he sees, quote, "something that makes a man doubtful of the constancy of the realities outside himself." He saw the Guinea fruit peddler change under his eyes, saw the dome of the forehead, the strong beaked nose, deep-set, fierce and fearless eyes, saw the head supported on pillared muscles, saw pride so deep and sure that it could play at humility. It was the shocking discovery that makes a man wonder, if I've missed this, what else have I missed? "You don't have to talk Dago talk," he said softly. What's most interesting is that despite this insight Ethan has into the possibility of Marullo's character being deeper and stronger than he's imagined, he still goes ahead and turns Marullo into the U.S. immigration authorities so that he will get deported and must sell in the store at what he thinks will be a reduced price. As Marullo becomes more humanized, Hawley seems to become less so, as evidenced by his consideration of a bribe offered to him by a salesman, and later the advice he gets from the banker, which leads him to assist in the death of his friend Danny, so he gets the deed of the property that will make him a wealthy man. Hawley often lectures to the goods in the store, and shortly after his encounter with Marullo, he addresses a case of tomato paste he is stocking onto the shelves. "Maybe you don't know, because of your kind, foreigners, money not only has no heart but no honor nor any memory. Money is respectable automatically if you keep it a while." He continues his speech referring to the sliced pickles as New Yorkers born, sliced and bottled, and concludes by invoking Marullo as our Lord and Master of the ancient Roman name, who says, "Where money is concerned, the ordinary rules of conduct take a holiday." The irony here is that Marullo, when the time comes, gives it all up to save his name. And Ethan is the cause and beneficiary of the Italians' largesse. In a later conversation, Ethan finds out that Marullo immigrated from Sicily in 1923. And when he suggests that Marullo return to visit, Marullo sees him as though he, quote, "saw me for the first time." Ethan knows he's planted this idea of a return in his mind, and Marullo notices that there's a change that has come over Ethan. We see this development in Marullo, where he's becoming more of an honest man, and Ethan is becoming more of a dishonest. When he shows up at the Hawley house on Easter Sunday with a bag of candy-colored eggs, the way Ebenezer Scrooge shows up at Bob Cratchit's house with a goose and all the trimmings for Christmas dinner, and later when he offers the Hawleys the use of his car for the July 4th holiday getaway. In many respects, these gestures suggest that Marullo is beginning to see Ethan more as a member of his family than an employee. Ethan has trouble figuring out why Marullo is doing this. And when his wife comments on Marullo's strange turn of behavior, Ethan wonders, Marullo did not reward for things past. He bribed for things to come. He was not interested in me except insofar as I could be of use to him. I went back over his business instruction and talked about Sicily. Somewhere he had lost his certainty. In some way he wanted something of me or needed something.